Constella Intelligence's latest breach report flagged a seismic shift in the tactics of cybercriminals. Identity, they argue, is now the most valuable and most vulnerable asset in the digital world. So who is Constella Intelligence and what makes them stand out in an increasingly crowded cyber risk arena? Well, today we are going beyond the headlines to take a closer look at the company itself, the minds behind the data, and the threats that keep the analysts up at night. Well, joining us in the C5 studio is Andreu, Constella's COO and CISO.
Thank you for having me.
Well, can we start with the company itself? What is your mission and what kinds of problem are you solving for your clients?
So our mission is to provide the best intelligence possible around breached identities. And if you factor in the reality of today's ecosystem, cybersecurity ecosystem, this is the path of least resistance into an environment for attackers. And so what we've set out to do is amass the largest data lake of breached identities, of breached data, of info stealer data that we can get our hands on. And we're talking about 15, 16 plus years at this point of that data being amassed. And so the data itself is of great value. What is of greater value now is the intelligence layer that we add on top of the data. And so we can very effectively give a data-driven risk posture, for instance, for any given identity that we get presented with.
So what kind of numbers are we talking about if you say you accumulated so much over these years?
Yeah, so the numbers get really interesting. The last count that I took off of our data lake, we had 49 billion records, and of those 49 billion, roughly 32 billion records possessed email addresses. Now you can start doing some rough math in your head. 32 billion email addresses, and I think there's roughly 8 billion people on this earth, of which some percentage is young and they're not in the in the digital world yet. You start to realize that, obviously there are multiple email addresses per one human, but that one human is an identity. So one of the values to our data is the ability to attribute on private information, leaked passwords and such, to be able to say that person A, email address A and email address B are actually the same person. And so that data starts to become very valuable in terms of investigations, intelligence, law enforcement, even the insurance market, for example. But from a corporate perspective, there's great value as well, because what you have as a corporate identity, an email address from a corporation, can get attributed to a number of personal email addresses. And if those are risky, in other words, your personal information has been leaked through an info stealer, for instance, a corporation should be aware of that because they're inside of your environment. And now you present risk because of your personal activity to that corporation.
So where do you keep all this data?
In a massive data lake out in multiple cloud environments.
This is a competitive space. What makes you unique?
The data. Ultimately, that is the answer. So if you look at a lot of cybersecurity companies, they provide products that provide value based on your environment, but they don't have 16 years plus worth of data. We do. And so from an intelligence perspective, especially from a time series intelligence perspective, our data is the differentiator.
So what does it take from your team, practically and mentally, to stay ahead of what you've just described as increasingly sophisticated identity threats?
So we have a fairly intense breach hunting program. It is a combination of automation and human processes. Ultimately, if I had to give you a short answer, you have to know where to look to find the right sets of data. You also have to know, in some cases, who to interact with to get your hands on the right data. And you can kind of fill in the blanks there without explicitly saying anything questionable. But at the end of the day, you're dealing with nefarious actors because they're the ones who are creating these data breaches. It's not like this is a squeaky clean type environment. And so long as you know where to look, you can get your hands on the data. We don't steal any data ourselves. We just know where to look.
So what does a typical day look like in your office and for you?
There is no typical day. The breach hunting program is continuous, and so I'll put that at a steady state. The process when it gets to, I'll give you a perfect example. You hear a lot about these massive breaches lately. Chances are those breaches are repeats. They're repackaged, and somebody's just trying to make noise or make money off of data that's already been leaked. And we have a lot of proof of that, because when we put it through our process of ingestion, we get hits on duplicates, meaning we already have that data. And so I always kind of chuckle when I hear, influencers and all these quote unquote cybersecurity experts, big breach, 60 billion records. They don't have any data contextually to say that is legit or not. They're just trying to make a headline. We look at it very differently, because to us, we don't want to duplicate anything because there's no value in the duplication. And so we have a very stringent normalization process for the data. And so let's say, a 60 billion record breach takes place today. We'll probably end up maybe with 1 billion new records. So we have a lot of this data already. And so that's a pretty intense part of our normal day-to-day process.
There's been a big data breach with Marks and Spencer, a very big retailer in the United Kingdom. How do you help companies like that?
Well, once an incident takes place, the incident response process of that company, the maturity of that process starts to come into play. We rarely get involved at the post-incident level. We are far more on the proactive side of things, especially with that intelligence layer that I mentioned earlier. And then obviously we're part of more of the investigative and OSINT side of the house. But, helping organizations after the fact, that's a different business model than what we follow.
Well, that's obviously the Holy Grail, to stop attacks before it happening.
Yes. And look, I've been in this industry 33 years. It is predominantly a reactive industry by its history. Any shift that you can make, that an organization can make to become more proactive, is a very positive thing. The challenge is that it is not trivial to become proactive. For example, I'll give you a perfect example, and I talk about this publicly a lot because this matters to me based on my background. You and I can bring 100 CISOs into a room tomorrow. High-level, big corporations, powerful CISOs. I almost guarantee you none of them have ever met an actual adversary. So what does that tell you? It tells you that this industry, for the most part, is fighting enemies that they don't understand, they've never met. It's like an invisible enemy. It's a fantasy to an extent. There's a lot of power in that observation, because if you come from the law enforcement or intelligence world, understanding your adversary is number one. And so you get to know them as best you can. My new book, my third book that's about to come out, is exactly on this subject. It's called The Adversarial Mindset for CISOs. And I think there's a lot of value in trying to push into that proactive area where you understand who exactly is interested in breaching my organization, because not every group is going to be interested in every organization. And so you can start to kind of narrow down the entities that would be interested in coming after the organization that you are protecting. And then you can start putting some mechanisms in place to hopefully mitigate the risk of those individuals, those groups.
I definitely want to hear about that book. Tell us about that.
So it really comes down to understanding the motivation, the mindset of attackers, because they're not all the same. Right? There's a large portion of this industry that is based on monetization, right? They want to make money off of their breaches. But then you do have corporate espionage, you have hacktivists, you have, politically driven actors. The money's not so important to them. Then you have other entities that want to basically, the whole ransomware model that want to, and ransomware comes in different forms. So ultimately, to me, if I had to break it down in the simplest terms, the world of attackers comes down to one of two things. They're either going to disrupt your services or they're going to exfiltrate, steal your data. And if you can start with those very simple premises, then you can start building these models of who exactly is coming after me. Now, this becomes really important in terms of getting proactive, because those threat actor models, those mindset profiles, can drive what's called red teaming activities, which can more properly prepare your organization for what's to come, rather than the historical tabletop exercises, which are all done under very controlled, rules of engagement. The attackers have no rules of engagement. So if you think about it sensibly, how much sense does it make to prepare for something by applying rules to your exercise when the adversary has no rules? I never understood that in this industry, but it's become a thing in the industry.
Well, in some cases, they are teenagers. Like in the case of Marks and Spencer's, they've arrested teenagers.
Yes. And so think about it. Teenagers are perfect for this world. Let's take a bright teenager. Obviously, you have some technical savviness and some intelligence. You take a bright teenager, chances are they are in an environment where there's not much else to do. So boredom works in the favor of, unfortunately, hacking. So you put a piece of technology in front of this bored, bright teenager, and for example, the digital drift theory. A lot of hackers started as just gamers, and to become better gamers, they figured out how to cheat the game. Well, cheating the game is just like hacking. So now all of a sudden you're a successful cheater at a game. You don't see that as a big deal. There's no repercussion, and you kind of drift into the cybercrime space. And the next thing you know, you realize that you can actually make a lot of money off of this rather than having some job that pays minimum wage. It's kind of a hard argument to take against this. And so there are a lot of, and then let me get into the power play as well, because I think it's important. So let's say you take an immigrant teenager in the UK who, let's say, doesn't like the United States, right? If you put a rifle in the hands of that teenager, they can only do but so much damage to the United States. I mean, what are you going to do? Come up against the U.S. Army with, one kid and one rifle? That's nonsensical. But put a laptop in that kid's hands and put the right skill and knowledge in their hands, they can be very disruptive to a larger American entity. So it's a balancing of power, if you will, in their heads, right? They can have a large impact rather than just go do something, traditional in the traditional crime space. And so there are a lot of factors that come into play here. But I think young people, if not guided properly, young, bright people are ripe for this industry.
It's so funny that we actually almost get back to a psychological level when you think about how to fight cybercrime, to think, what do you do with, teenagers that age and these things, that sort of sociology mixing with, something hard and tangible is quite interesting.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody has an easy solution. I think if you come from an impoverished physical area, I grew up in a pretty bad area in New York. If you can implement programs that guide young people into trying to use their energies, skills, whatever, into something positive, I think there are generally decent outcomes there. The problem is building those programs, funding them, having people that actually care enough to volunteer their time. For example, I've been in the judo space for 42 years. And when I was still in New York, I taught an underprivileged youth program of 250 kids for free. I used to teach judo every Tuesday night in Brooklyn. That was an outlet for those kids, because otherwise they'd be hanging out on the streets. And so coming up with those kind of programs, I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but it could help. Even if it helps one kid not become a cyber criminal, but become an ethical, cybersecurity expert, I think there's value in that.
Well, especially because they can do so much damage, as you said, that you can't do if you have a gun. So I'd love to hear your backstory. You mentioned a bit about it. You moved from federal law enforcement into cyber. So what drew you to the space?
So I did start my career in a federal law enforcement agency, and while I was there, I ended up on the technical side building wiretap technologies in the 90s. And so I became fascinated with this, because one of the early lessons that I got from an old timer was, you can do all of the street field work in the world and gather up all that evidence. Now remember, this is in the 90s, and you end up in court, and it's a battle to prove that you did everything ethically and all that. You can set up one wiretap and get these people recorded on a call, and the effort is so much lower and the impact is so much higher. And I realized that's just a more strategic and smart way to approach this. And so I ended up in that space, and I really enjoyed it. And I learned a lot when I was in the government. I worked with probably the most mission-oriented people I've ever met. It was an amazing experience for me. And I never looked back. I wanted to be in the field, but my path is just different, and that's okay.
So we can't talk to you without talking about your latest breach report that revealed 107 billion exposed records. That is alarming. So what does it tell us about how hackers operate today?
So, it's a game of volume. If you start thinking about those numbers, it sounds staggering. But of that 107 billion, I think something like 6% were new to us. Going back to my earlier point, a lot of this data has been breached for a long time. And, this stuff gets repackaged, like I said, to make noise, to create buzz, to make money. But point is, that type of volume equates to a very interesting level of risk to organizations. The challenge is getting an organization's cybersecurity teams to understand that risk. Because if you think about the traditional security models, and a lot of companies are really stuck 10 years ago in the cybersecurity space, they're focused, for instance, on protecting your endpoint, which nothing wrong with that. Obviously, you have to protect the endpoint. But if that endpoint has nothing of tremendous value, the importance starts to diminish. Yes, you can use it to pivot laterally and stuff like that. I'm not negating any of that. My point is, the identity that gets onto that laptop, from my perspective, is just as important as protecting the laptop itself, because that identity comes with added baggage, let's say. I'll give you an example. Factor in the work from home models, factor in the fact that a lot of business today can take place either on your corporate machine or your personal machine. You can install the software to get onto your, corporate environment on your personal machine. Those are two very different machines. If they're not configured identically, you have different levels of protection. But it's the same identity. It's the same person. So if I turn on my corporate laptop, I get on VPN and all the traditional models, okay, there's a lot of protection in all of that. But if I get onto some work environment as I'm traveling or I'm from home, whatever, it happens. I get on from my personal machine to do some work. All of a sudden, all of my personal baggage became part of the corporate challenge. My point is that all comes back to the identity. So if you understand the risk level of that identity, you start to be able to put together a better picture and a better strategy to protect your organization, because not all identities represent the same risk. I'll give you a perfect example. Let's say I am an employee of a company. I get into my environments in different ways. I am one of 10 people that have access to a database that has a lot of private information, right? PII. Of those 10 people, because I am a gamer also in my personal life and my data has been breached through my gaming activities, of those 10 people, I now represent a different level of risk to the organization than someone who doesn't play games, doesn't do anything crazy in their personal life, whatever. The organization should be aware of the fact that of those 10 people, there is a different level of risk attached to each one. A lot of organizations don't have that because they don't have the data to back up a risk profile.
So looking ahead, is anything bubbling under at Constella? Maybe just give us a preview of future plans.
So we're actually working on a number of interesting partnerships, especially in the synthetic identification space. And so if you start thinking in terms of the deepfake challenges that the world has now, we're partnering up with a company that, for instance, can identify whether an image or a video is potentially fake. And we are enriching their intelligence based on the identification of the human involved in that investigation, for lack of a better term. We can provide data-driven risk profiles for those identities to basically enrich that offering. Because, you know, if you have one source that says, well, this is fake, that's one thing. But if you have two sources, that starts to, you know, change the dynamic of the accuracy of two separate sources saying, yes, this is fake. And as it turns out, our data lake has an interesting use case that nobody really foresaw until recently. And that is, we've been able to prove with a high level of accuracy when an identity is synthetic because they have no breach record, and yet we have 15, 16 years of breaches. So if you're a working professional, the likelihood of you ever having been breached is pretty high. So you have these 30, 40-year-old adults that show up in an organization, and the email address they use has never been seen. It was created 2 weeks ago. You know, you start to put all the pieces together, and there's a certain percentage of accuracy to say this is a synthetic or a fraudulent identity.
Well, deepfakes is a big new field. If you look at how good they become with AI, they become so good, and politically they're so charged. You know, that's probably, you talked about identity theft, but that is a big area, I think, for companies or for individuals, for politicians. It's very important to determine what's real.
Yeah. I mean, look at you. Your voice has probably, been proliferated all over the internet for years. That's what you do. That's your profession, right? And maybe your video and your image as well. And so it is not difficult now for a nefarious entity or even a kid playing around to find elements of you and make it look like you are saying something that you never said. And that's pretty disturbing.
And it's loaded if it's a very high-profile politician.
Yeah.
So the world you live in is becoming more and more difficult, and the attacks are becoming more prolific.
If you look at the report and you see the large numbers of, for instance, info stealer leaks that we've been able to discover, and forget about the number. If you look at the actual growth, that's the more disturbing part. But my point is, you look at how many billions are spent every year on endpoint protection, which is a necessity. And yet info stealers get leaked or get installed on these machines and leak data at the rate that we're finding them. Something's clearly not working. You see my point? And so the protections that organizations think they have with the products they've deployed may not be as effective as they think they are. And again, this is me 30 plus years into an industry that I love. You just learn that nothing's foolproof and nothing ever works 100%. So you have to protect yourself at all these different layers and from all these different angles.
So why Constella? Why should they come to you?
Because our data speaks tells a very good story of the history of an identity. And I think that identity risk that we can give you is of great value to any organization.
Oh, Andreu, it's so interesting speaking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.